Okay, so I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the seminar, The New Trading Disorder. I'm Edoardo Campanella. I'm a research fellow at the Moss Center, and I'm delighted to, is it good, the sound? Okay. I'm delighted to moderate this panel on one of the hottest topics of our time. We decided to call it disorder with this in bracket, because even if the system looks more chaotic and messier than before, we think it might still have a logic, or at least we will try to understand whether there is a logic behind it. And I can't think of two better experts than Katherine and Robert to find out whether there is a logic and what this logic look like. Katherine was the US trade representative during the Biden administration. She's now a fellow at the Institute of Politics for the fall semester. Robert is a professor here at HKS teaching courses on international trade. He's a fellow at the Peterson Institute, author most recently of the book Behind the Curve. And this book is very relevant because I think this is one of the rare events at HKS where there will be disagreement and between the speakers. And essentially in this book, Robert is quite critical of the ability of industrial policies to revitalize the manufacturing sector. So without further ado, I think we can start from you, Katherine. And before we discuss what's going on right now with the Trump administration, I think it's important to step back for a moment and discuss your experience within the Biden administration, because the Biden administration, in a way, marked a departure from the old neoliberal mantra. And essentially what you tried to promote as a trade representative was a worker-centered trade policy. What was the vision behind it?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think.
How about now? Is it better? Yes. Okay, good. We were trying to do trade differently in the Biden administration, in large part because we were coming on the heels of the Trump administration. And the Trump administration had really changed everything when it came to trade. But the Trump administration and President Trump himself and his views didn't come from nowhere. It came from our own experience with trade. What's interesting is I think that for President Trump himself, that the neoliberal trade order actually did his businesses quite well when his businesses did well. But he was tapped into the experience of a set of Americans that had, during that neoliberal era from the 1980s and 1990s onwards, felt really abandoned by policymakers in Washington and around the world. And that's certainly the experience in the United States. So having lived through the Trump administration the first time and the Trump trade policies and the renegotiation of the NAFTA and taking on the competition with the Chinese economy, it was very clear to us, and by us I would say President Biden himself and those on his trade team, that there was no going back. There was no going back to the neoliberal era, that everything had changed. And in fact, through the neoliberal era, there were many who were critical of the fundamentals of the assumptions about what would bring peace and prosperity to America and the rest of the world. So we talked about it as middle out economics, or bottom up, middle out, where we're building the economy. And this was about more than trade. It was about the entire economic agenda. It was about middle out, bottom up. And there's a lot of this, you know, like kind of you're trying to describe a tree. And it makes more sense if you understand that what we were trying to do is to draw a contrast to an era of economic policies, including trade policies that were top down, that were trickle down, where the theory essentially was you pump all of the benefits to the top. You make the top prosperous, the top layer of the economy, the haves, and then you rely on some kind of force of economic gravity to trickle that prosperity down to the workers in those companies, to the places where those companies are located, to the communities around them. And over time, what we have discovered is that prosperity has grown quite a lot. That part of the economic theory did work. By removing barriers, by liberalizing, by cutting taxes, by shrinking government, you did create all of this prosperity, a tremendous amount. But that prosperity got trapped in places and it didn't trickle down. So our entire theory was, well, let's do something different. Let's try to turn neoliberalism on its head. I think that we took a lot of inspiration from the Roosevelt era and the New Deal era. I know, you can't go back in time, but I think that there was inspiration around government becoming a part of the solution, about investing in people and communities and in industries. And that was the theory for also how we were going to do trade differently. Instead of just telling governments to get out of the way, instead of just letting the private sector and capital do what they want, which is to get richer, to be rich. What we were inclined to do was to say, there are many factors of production. Some of them were treated with a lot of respect. Others were really excluded from policymaking. Let's make room for them. Workers being a primary part of the economy that felt like they had been given short shrift. So that meant taking our trade policies and fundamentally rethinking them. That meant also not being always 180 degrees opposed to what Trump had done, but to see what he had done in the breakage and then to figure out how to fix and mend what needed to be fixed and mended. Top of the list, relationships with our trading partners, relationships with stakeholders within the American economy, and then to see constructively what could we do with the breakage. It created a kind of an opportunity for a rebuild. And that's what we were trying to do. We came in with a very reform-minded program to see if we could make trade a part of a comprehensive economic agenda that was going to reprioritize whose views, whose interests we were going to serve through our economic policies.
Thanks, Katherine. I think, Robert, maybe it may be useful to bring in your economist perspective. How would you assess this experience of the Biden administration, this refocus on workers and the bottom of the income curve?
Well, firstly, yeah. So I think first the proof of the pudding is kind of in the eating. If you actually look, a major focus of the policies were on stimulating manufacturing employment as being synonymous with improving the well-being of workers in America. Actually, when the administration was done with 4 years of its programs, the level of manufacturing employment in the United States was not significantly different than it had been at the peak just before COVID. So I think in substance, the impact was not highly significant. But I want to focus specifically on the approach adopted in trade. Was it really a worker-centric policy? Were the policies that were initiated going to advance the interests of American workers? Because that was the claim. I don't believe, I do believe that there were some contributions. Significantly, there was a deep concern for the enforcement of labor standards. And I think the administration changed things when it came to, in particular, the relationship between workers and management within the Mexican economy. That, I would say, was an achievement. However, if I think of the major vehicles by which workers are affected, I think first and foremost, the issue is living standards. And because that is relevant to all of the workers in the United States, not just those who work in the tradable goods sector. And I think that the protectionist stances, which were adopted by the administration, actually reduced living standards through raising trade barriers on inputs like steel and aluminum, and indeed keeping the high trade barriers that had been put on many Chinese imports across the board. What the evidence suggests is it was American consumers who paid those tariffs. And we saw the ramifications of higher costs of living in the last election. Secondly, we know that we live in a world of global supply chains. And indeed, the administration spent a lot of time studying these global supply chains. But the impact of a global supply chain is that if you put taxes on inputs as important as steel and aluminum, and you keep them in place at levels like 50%, you are going to perhaps preserve some steel and aluminum jobs, although if you look at the data, not all that many, but actually damage the competitiveness of many other parts of that supply chain. And so I don't see that the employment creation effects of those policies are actually positive in a world of supply chains. Thirdly, I think American workers need to be defended against unfair trade practices. But one mechanism for doing that is to reinforce a system based on rules. What the administration did was to continue essentially gutting the appellate body of the WTO by refusing to engage in reforms. And that meant they had no ability to deal with foreign unfair practices through the rules. And in particular, the WTO rules allow actions which could be taken, for instance, as I read the WTO rules on subsidies, and indeed, as we saw in the cotton case, the big problem coming from China is it has created huge excess capacity, which has disrupted global markets. Well, there is a way to challenge China using the rules. Instead, I saw very few challenges. I saw the tariffs being maintained, the Chinese actually not observing their commitments originally to buy American products. And so actually some selective tariffs toward the end, but very little action on that front to pursue the unfair practices abroad. Fourth, we know exports pay higher wages.
Robert, not to quibble, but
Okay.
I think you're on fifth now.
Okay, I'm pleased you're keeping track. Okay.
I told you there would have been disagreement.
Okay, I have enough. We know that exports pay higher wages, but the administration actually refused to sign market access agreements. Indeed, free trade agreements were passé. Instead, it sought its own form of trade agreements, but which avoided dealing with the traditional type of trade agreement. Now, what's interesting about the traditional trade agreement is that generally American tariffs are very low. Foreign tariffs are significantly higher. So what a trade agreement which includes market access actually does is to reduce tariffs for American exports by far more than it reduces tariffs for foreign exports. So I think it's a good deal for America to pursue these because it provides more opportunities for American workers. And finally, I think a worker-centered policy would heavily focus on improving America's adjustment within the labor market and America's place-based policies for left-behind places. The administration actually allowed the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which was not enough, but at least something to help workers who were dislocated as a result of international trade. They allowed that program to lapse. And so there were no improvements significantly in the operation of the American labor market. And the damage that had been felt by places and the labor markets due to China and other competition weren't adequately dealt with by the administration. So there are a lot of areas in which I don't believe a truly worker-centric policies was followed, and I think we could have done much better.
Katherine, before we move on and we talk about what's going on right now.
Yeah, you have to let me respond, right? Okay, yeah, it's because those are fighting words, Robert.
Oh.
Yes, I mean, I think that, worker centrism was such a big part of what we were trying to do and such a big part of my own commitment to our workers and to the American economy that if I were in a different mood, I would interpret your words as calling me a liar and a failure. And I fully reject that. You have to know, and this is the second time that you have blamed the Biden administration for allowing the lapse of TAA. You know full well the last time we talked about this, which was in public, TAA is a statute. That means it's Congress's job to reauthorize it. The Biden administration put sweat and equity into this. By the way, it's not a USTR issue. It's run out of the Department of Labor. But you keep laying that at my feet, and I don't know why. I don't know why our conversation doesn't evolve, because this is the second time. If you're trying to score points with the audience, well, I didn't think that that was exactly the point of this particular panel. But let me just call out, I'm not here to fight you. But those are fighting words. A lot of what you said in a different mood, I would consider to be deeply offensive. So let me just take a moment to respond. First, on the statistics in terms of reinvigorating manufacturing. Now, you have admitted that we created manufacturing jobs. Where you're dinging us is you're saying that we didn't recover, well, we only recovered jobs. We only hit the levels that had been prior to COVID, right? But I mean, we created manufacturing jobs, right? Because we had more before COVID, we had less in COVID.
Yes.
Then where did they come from? They were created. Yes. I mean, it's just a math problem. It's my turn. It's my turn. I was very good. I only told you had miscounted.
I'm not going to interrupt you.
Yes.
I just wanted to try to get a pen.
Okay.
So here's the thing, right? Neoliberal trade policies have done their thing for 40 years. We had 4 years of a Biden administration that was coming on a destructive force, a sometimes creative, but mostly destructive force of the first Trump administration. 4 years, I think that's a pretty good record by all accounts and admission of those in the Biden administration. There is a lot more that we need to do, that we needed to do to reprogram the economic and political order to establish what comes after neoliberalism. So I think that given 4 years versus 40, I think that our record was pretty good. And I think that those first 4 years of a constructive rebuild, let me tell you, it's really hard. If you're talking about construction, right, your tornado has blown down your house, you need to rebuild it. Clearing away the site and then reestablishing the foundation is really hard work. All right. Second, investments, the kinds of investments we are trying to make and to make our trade policies work in tandem with them, they take time. I will tell you that I think that, one of the things that Joe Biden was really invested in was that infrastructure law. And I think that the fruits of that infrastructure law will manifest into the future beyond the time of the Biden administration. Why? That's just the nature of the way things are. It takes time to build and it takes time to rebuild, right? So I think that fundamentally unfair to judge us where we are at year 4 and not recognize the tremendous amount of change that's required to put in a tremendous amount of political capital and actually the tremendous amount of courage that's required to stand up and to try to do something new. Because let me tell you, it is not a new experience for me to have very smart people stand up and tell me that everything we were trying to do was ill-conceived, was economically unsound, was dumb, was apparently not what we were intending to do. The weight of the establishment and established thinking is staggering. And it's particularly galling in a time when everything around us in the world is changing. So many smart, respected people just told me what we couldn't do, what was a bad idea. Very few people actually stood up and said, I think I know what you're trying to get at. I do think that the world could be better. Here, let me help you. Let me take my experience. And instead of tearing you down, let me help you. Right? And so I feel like I'm having a flashback to my 4 years in office in the midst of this conversation. Thank you for recognizing that we've done something in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement that actually, I think that, you know, you gave us some points for what we've done in that agreement to be worker-centered. I actually think that what we've done is profound. And it has always been surprising to me how little people know about what we did in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. For the NAFTA agreement, which was tremendously unpopular and extremely controversial at the time of its passing, very unpopular with our working communities, with our industrial unions, in the renegotiation, quite unexpectedly, congressional Democrats and the first Trump administration actually came together and created something together, right? Politically, what's interesting is neither one of us likes each other. We continue not to like each other. Congressional Democrats continue to be extremely opposed to the Trump administration in its second incarnation, and similarly the other direction. I think that's one reason why this particular mechanism doesn't get a lot of self-promotion. Politically, it's a little bit uncomfortable to say, look at this amazing thing that we Democrats did with the Trump administration, right? But I've also asked the reporters who cover the trade beat while I was in, and I've said, this is actually the most innovative thing and the most remarkable thing that America has done in trade in this modern era. Why do you not report on it at all? And they said, well, you know, 2 reasons they gave me. I'm like, I knew these trade reporters very well, and I appreciate that they were really honest with me. The first response I got was, well, it's an example of something that was going well between Mexico and the United States. Our editors say nobody wants to read that. Okay, so, right, phenomenally innovative, novel, not getting reported on because it's not going to get clicks. That speaks to another challenge that we have around the business model of our information systems. The second reason they gave me was, well, each individual case, you are empowering Mexican workers. Mexican workers are receiving back pay. They're receiving the first raises that they have maybe ever gotten in these jobs in decades. Wrongly terminated employees are being reinstated. People are getting better benefits because now they have real unions who can advocate for them. And they said, but you know, each individual case, and even if you take the 24 cases that you brought and won, it's still a drop in the bucket in the overall dynamic of the US-Mexican economy and the terms of competition between your workers. And each one of these cases, and even in aggregate, the 24 cases that you've resolved, isn't enough to move markets, right? So what I do want to call to your attention is that particular mechanism, with everything that I've just admitted, people didn't want to report on it. It is a drop in the bucket in terms of changing the course of trade history. Nevertheless, for the first time, imagine this, for the first time, industrial workers in Mexico, American workers, have the opportunity to empower themselves uniquely through a trade agreement. There's no other mechanism like this. It is available in a trade agreement. and they are able to secure better rights. This is nothing that has been achieved before. And I think that, in passing, giving us a, small credit, I would just say, I wish more people would pay attention to this. In fact, weirdly, right, Trump administration doesn't like to talk about how this came about through cooperation with Democrats. My successor has continued every case that I started that I didn't have time to finish. In fact, over the course of this summer, the second Trump administration, picking up my work, secured the first ever victory in a trade agreement that went in favor of workers. Nobody knows about it. It wasn't reported on. Let me just tell you, there's a complete through line from the Trump 1 negotiations to Biden to Trump 2 in this particular area, and it's really worth examining. Part 3, I'll get through this, Edoardo, I know, because I don't want to hijack this. You have a whole program that's planned. On living standards, this is again the argument that tariffs always raise prices, that the inflation that we saw during the Biden administration is because we left the tariffs in place. In fact, the Peterson Institute did a whole study about what would happen if we took away all American tariffs, if we took away all of the Buy American provisions, and the resulting impact on inflation, I forget the exact number, was less than 1%, right? So it is true that we experienced extremely painful inflationary pressures during our second, third, and then into our fourth years. So where did that come from? I posit this for all of you, and I think that there are more and more economists who are coming to this view. The inflationary pressures that we were seeing around the world, but here in the United States, were being driven by supply chain, supply-demand mismatches that were spillover effects from COVID and all of the discombobulations that came after that. So yes, I agree with you. It is about supply chains, but let me tell you, what we need in terms of looking at our supply chains and redesigning them is actually a more open view to where we need tariffs and where we don't need tariffs, where we dial restrictions up and where we liberalize. I really have a problem with tariffs are never appropriate and tariffs are always appropriate. So I'm going to ding the neoliberal perspective, which is tariffs are always terrible. And then I'm also going to ding what seems like the Trump 2 perspective, which is tariffs are great and you can always turn to them for solutions. The appellate body, I'm not even going to get into unless there's a show of hands that people want to talk about it.
About the WTO
you want to get to that?
later,
Okay,
so,
all right. I'll leave that to you, Edoardo, then.
So I mean, this panel is not about the Biden administration and the experience 2 years ago. So I would like to move.
But don't think that if I haven't gotten to it, I don't concede that Robert is correct.
But
you
I
understand?
think
I reserve my objections in all areas.
I think it's important to talk about the Biden administration to understand where we are. But I would like to talk about where we are. So if you want to briefly, but less than 1 minute, react because we only have half an hour, and I would like also to allow the audience to ask questions.
All I would say,
very brief.
Yes, I understand. I won't repeat what I had said, except to note that if you look at the profile of manufacturing employment growth, what you will see is that there was a peak in 2019. There was a deep trough associated with COVID. There was a rebound, part of which was part of the administration, of the Biden administration. And then for 2 years, essentially, manufacturing employment was flat. And that meant, given the growth in the labor market, that the manufactured employment share continued to fall. I believe that a worker-oriented policy has to extend its view far towards far more than just the manufacturing sector. 90% of Americans work in services. And so our focus really needs to be on the services sector and how we can facilitate the availability of ladder jobs for workers who don't have high school degrees. I have a variety of ideas. I'm sorry, I've tried to write on them. They don't seem to have reached the administration's ears at the time that they were in office. But I believe that the emphasis should be on broad labor market adjustments and broad community adjustments, as opposed to trade-focused processes to deal with fundamental worker problems.
I would like to talk about what's going on right now with the Trump administration. You said that basically after the first Trump administration, it was impossible to go back to the old system. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
That's because you turned your head.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said basically it was impossible to go back to the old system after the first Trump administration. And now the second Trump administration is highly protectionist, and it's doing what it is doing among the many reasons that they suggest, because they want to revitalize the American middle class. So how do you think the approach of this administration differ with the approach that you adopted during the Biden administration?
Okay. Does the American economy, does life in America feel different today than it did during the Biden administration? You ask any of our trading partners, I think if they're going to be honest, the answer would be yes, it feels different. I think if you ask most Americans, I think the answer would be yes also.
The approach is different. The rhetoric is certainly different.
Let me revisit something that you said.
No, my point is more about, just to clarify, my point is how is, in terms of final goal of protectionism, do you think there is a different view? Leave aside the method.
What do you mean by protectionism? Do you mean tariffs?
Yeah, also industrial policy more broadly.
Because there's an argument that the Trump administration is actually not that protectionist. If you let me make this argument.
Go ahead, yeah.
So if I understand, right, protectionism is about trying to advance your own interests, like pushing back on trade. Here's my argument. You can help me refine this. The argument is this: the Trump administration puts down lots and lots of tariffs. That feels very protectionist. They talk about America first. That feels very protectionist, right? Classic. You kind of are mean to everybody else so that you can be richer and stronger, right? Those feel protectionist. I guess this is something that I see, which is one of the justifications the Trump administration advances for the tariffs is they're multiple. One of them is, well, their leverage. They're negotiating leverage for negotiating better deals with our trading partners, right? And I think that that's really very interesting, right? So I'm going to hold in suspension my complete judgment, and I'll say, all right, I've been a negotiator. Leverage is great in a negotiation, but leverage isn't valuable for its own sake. The question is, what are you going to use that leverage for, right? Are you going to use it for good? Are you going to use it to build for the interests of the collective, for the common good? Or are you going to use that leverage for other purposes, right? If you look at, and I'll have to admit, I haven't looked carefully at the latest set of agreements that have been announced. But if you look at what the Trump administration is securing with the leverage of increased tariffs, right? In exchange for moderating those increased tariffs, what are the things that they are asking other countries to do? One thing, interestingly, a lot of these agreements have the forced labor import ban commitment inside of them. That's interesting to me because that is something that is right in the worker lane. Right? Lots of questions about how you implement it. I'll set those aside. That's interesting. But there's also ways in which what the Trump administration seems to be extracting from trading partners is promises not to regulate or get in the way of American businesses. And some of the biggest American businesses who already have more power, more money than most other countries even, right? And in that sense, then, I don't know if what they're doing is protectionist. They're just going out there to liberalize on behalf of American companies, right? So, I think I know what you're getting at. I just wanted to make the point that don't be fully distracted by the tariffs.
Yeah,
the tariffs are doing something else too, and I want to make sure that people are following all of the breadcrumbs to get the big picture of what the Trump administration is doing.
Yeah, I mean, Europeans believe that the Biden administration was more protectionist than the Trump administration, first administration, because of the
Inflation Reduction Act. Okay, so right,
So
Yeah.
They were not related to tariffs, but they were perceived to be highly protectionist,
all right.
from a European
perspective. So
perspective.
from the European perspective, I don't know if you want to play the role of the European, right? How do you feel now that the Inflation Reduction Act has been gutted? There's no more Inflation Reduction Act. All of the steps forward that the United States has made to try to jumpstart an economic investment environment into the next generation of technologies, poof, gone. Any benefits that there might have been for European renewable companies, also gone, right? And I know that there have been some European economists, and maybe you can debate them, I'm not an economist, who were seeing that the Inflation Reduction Act's incentives were actually playing to many of Europe's manufacturing capabilities, right? What was interesting to me was for all of the body blows that I got from my European friends on the Inflation Reduction Act, no one's ever stopped to say, we're really glad that you, America, that have this deeply polarized political problem around climate action, congratulations, you have finally joined us in reaching for solutions. So, on that, I also feel deeply misunderstood by the rest of the world. And I guess what I would say, bring us back to what you want to talk about, which is the current Trump administration. I guess what I would say is the best thing about the second Trump administration, the most positive thing that I can say as a former Biden official, is that at least now, most people I know have woken up to the fact that everything has changed. And we all have to turn around, look forward, and help each other figure out how to navigate our way to a better world. Because I think that for the 4 years I was in, I was not only getting all the smart people and the experts telling me what you're doing is badly conceived, it's a bad idea, stop doing it. But a lot of our trading partners were also saying, why aren't you just going back to the way the world was in 2015? We would all prefer it. Please just restore everything about the WTO. Please just rejoin the TPP. Please pick up the TTIP. Even though I will say, I think that for the TTIP, the political problem in Europe was more severe than it was in the United States in 2015 and 2016. So the Trump administration comes in the second time, they break more things, they do more unorthodox things, but maybe the good thing that will come out of this time is everyone will start to think in more creative ways about, hey, could this world be better? And how could we work together to make this a better world without tying ourselves in knots and without the straitjacket of all of the rules that actually gave us the world that used to be?
So the problem with too much creativity is that it can lead to unpredictability. And I think this is probably the problem that many trading partners of the US are facing right now. But let's try to move on and talk about, you want to say something, I guess. Okay, but I mean, you
Edoardo, give us a time check so that you can give him some.
Yeah, so because we have 20 minutes, I would like to, okay.
You got to give me a chance.
Okay.
No, so my central, first, the stylized view of economists who are extremists who say complete free trade on the one hand or complete protectionism with tariffs on the other is phony. It's not realistic. We've negotiated traditional trade agreements, and particularly in the World Trade Organization, we retain tariffs on sensitive sectors. That was politically necessary. But I want to turn to my central problem, and that is that I believe that we had already established a trading system that was enthusiastically being supported by countries in the rest of the world. Now, it was inadequate for our needs, but there was immense scope, as I see it, to build on what had already been agreed upon, as opposed to, and so Katherine's view is, we just wanted to keep doing the same dumb things as we were doing before because there were imperfections in the previous system. My view is, we needed to build on what we had already established, a rules-based system that we could now mold in order to meet the challenges that are currently facing us. So I commend the administration for having picked up the task and taken on the task of adapting to climate change. And there I give them my full approval. However, I don't think it was necessary for them to do it in a way, for instance, that clearly violate the WTO subsidies codes. Because throughout the Inflation Reduction Act, there are special benefits given to the use of domestic products in favor of imports. And we know, and Katherine full well knows, this is a prohibited subsidy. Now, could we have opened the market? That would have been even better for climate change. You know, if you think about it, we should have, I believe, promoted the greening of America using the available products from all over the world, particularly from outside China. Because I think in conjunction with friendshoring, we could have done far better. Let's take solar panels as just one example. Solar panels, if you look seriously at them, are not a strategic threat. And if you, I asked my ChatGPT, what is the elasticity of demand for solar panels? And it turns out it's 2. So what we did in America is to raise the price of solar panels. Now, to their credit, in my view, for a period, the Biden administration actually allowed some of these panels to come in from Southeast Asian countries without tariffs. However, by and large, the price of those panels was 2 or 3 times what they were in the rest of the world. So we slowed down the greening of America by adopting an illegal protectionist approach. I would have loved to have seen an open approach where there were no strategic threats to us. And again, I would commend the administration on taking supply chain supply seriously. There are areas which have to be designated as significant for national security purposes. And there we had become too dependent on China. And I see a role there for protection in trying to deal with cordoning off truly sensitive tech and dual use sectors. Now, it so happens that they omitted an adequate program, as we found out, for rare earths. Now, we were signaled about the need to take such a measure, you know, when Japan was targeted by China more than a decade ago. But apparently, we remained vulnerable. And there I fault them for not having taken what is the most obvious vulnerability, and in particular, in conjunction with an effort to try to protect the, to prevent the export of semiconductors, you know, you've got to look at whether or not you're vulnerable before you take such measures. And I think, you know, while leverage has been exerted by the Trump administration quite effectively over the countries who need American defense protection, when it's come to China, it's absolutely failed. So I do think we need to avoid single country dependency. And in there, I would favor some transitory protection until we improve diversification. I commend them in improving our relationship with allies, but I think we should be building capacity with our allies rather than trying to onshore everything to the United States. Because I think from an allied standpoint, we seem to be talking on both sides of our mouth. I also believe, though, that there are immense areas where I think we can have a green light approach with China. I am not in favor of trying to stop all trade with China. And as I understand it, and it'd be interesting to hear Katherine's view on this question, her reluctance to sign trade agreements is because, and I heard this at the last session period we were at, at her presentation, was that she views these as a way in which China essentially is going to be able to get into the United States market indirectly. And there is no question that a lot of Chinese products have come through indirectly. But I believe that there's a lot of trade we should be having with China. So only to the degree that there are strategic vulnerabilities should we be inhibiting that trade, but otherwise we should be promoting it.
Before we open up the floor for a question from the audience, Katherine, maybe I think it's good if you elaborate on what, in your opinion, could be a good China strategy from a trade perspective, leaving aside what you did during the Biden administration, thinking about the future. What should be the US approach to China when it comes to trade?
That's a huge question. So
and you have only 2 minutes. You have only 2 minutes.
Okay. So because that's so unfair, I'm going to do something unfair. I'm going to take 30 seconds to respond to something Robert said, which is, Robert, how do you lay the responsibility for the design of the Inflation Reduction Act at the feet of the Biden administration, again, when it was a statute that was negotiated primarily out of the Senate between, and this is inside baseball, Senator Schumer and Senator Manchin? I feel like we need to, in addition to TAA, the IRA process, I feel like you need maybe a refresher course in civics in terms of how a bill comes to be a law, right? I mean, the fact that we got the Inflation Reduction Act at all was a miracle of the math and whatever happened inside that Senate to make that happen. And this is actually a point that I brought up with the Europeans because they were so angry about it. And I said, you know what? You're democracies, we're democracy. Guess what, guys? This is what our democracy produced. And now I've got to defend it because this is the best that we were able to do now. And I think that I take the long view of it, which is, Robert, everything you've described about the Inflation Reduction Act and how it could have been better and how it could have been perfect. You know what? Let's try again because we're going to have to because it doesn't exist anymore. Edo, to you on China. Okay, and I've got a minute now, right?
Very less, but yeah.
It is a very good question. I think it's going to be hard. Right? Like, if I could answer that question in 30 seconds, then why haven't we done it? Truly, it is hard. 2 largest economies in the world, a lot of interdependencies, some synergies, okay? A lot of friction, a lot of polarization in terms of the rest of the world. We used to talk about economic coercion in terms of what China did to Japan on rare earths back in 2011, 2012, right? Economic coercion, like, wow, this is very scary. When you have that kind of economic leverage over other countries, you can express your displeasure with them by really putting them under economic pressure. Full honesty, if I look around today and I'm listening to the economic coercion conversations that other countries are having, a lot of it is about the United States, right? So if you're third countries outside of the US-China bilateral axis, then you're constantly trying to balance your reliances and relationships with these two. But at the end of the day, I think you still want to have 2 as opposed to just relying on 1, right? And I think that from where I sit looking at the challenge that other countries have and the challenge for the global economy in this bilateral relationship, it's a multidimensional challenge. And the fact is that, right, no matter how geopolitics change on this planet, there will always be a United States and there will always be a China. And given that, I think that that needs to guide all of the choices we make around how we manage to coexist in the best possible way for our respective people, our workers, our businesses, our middle classes, but also how we can do that in the best possible way for the rest of the world too. And it's hard. I don't have an answer for you, definitely not in 30 seconds, but I think it means leaning into this moment of change.
Thanks. So I think now we can open up the floor for questions. Maybe if you can introduce yourself and.
My name is Erin. I'm from the U.S.-China Business Council, so I would love a second full panel on how to handle China policy. But for this panel specifically, I want to ask about U.S. industrial policy. I think, whether the panelists happen to agree that it's needed or not, it feels like, at least in the last week, we've seen 3 reports coming out essentially recommending this. I think it was the U.S.-China Commission in Congress, the IT Innovation Forum, and then another task force report from the Council on Foreign Relations, led by your colleague, Secretary Raimondo.
Former colleague, but
Yes,
yes.
former colleague.
Yes.
And so I want to ask, pulling from your diverse experiences, especially yours on the Hill, do you have faith that the American system can pull off the kind of industrial policy that people are calling for? And then as a follow-up to that, with a focus on protecting workers, how do you create a worker-centered industrial policy with lots of money flowing? How do we make sure that people who do the production are able to make a living? I'll end it there.
Thanks. Maybe there is also one question, then we get to it. Yeah, because there are people watching on Zoom.
I'm Ishan. I'm faculty here. I teach trade and climate change. I guess I'm curious. It totally makes sense what you're saying about the false dichotomy of we don't have to approve of everything that a given president does or disapprove of everything they do. But I'm curious if you had to rank President Trump's trade policies against the 2 prior Democratic presidents before President Biden, Obama and Clinton. If you had to rank them 1, 2, 3, where would President Trump's trade policies fall among those 3? Trump, Obama, Clinton? Like everything taken together.
Even more difficult than my China question, probably.
Oh, it's an interesting one, and let me think about it. Let me start with the industrial policy question. Can we make it happen? I believe we can, because I'm an optimist. I actually think that if we pull off a successful modern American industrial policy that is able to create good jobs, that is able to allow us to create or maintain industries that are important to the future, to today and the future, that is a good outcome for the US, but it will also be a good outcome for the US-China relationship. I think losing more industries to China, if we don't do anything, if we don't start taking measures that are different from what we've done before, if we just let the chips fall where they may, we know how incredibly competitive Chinese industrial policies and they have been, and how incredibly powerful they are today. If we don't stand up for ourselves, then it's kind of like the fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me situation, right? And I say this that, if we can do that to defend our ability to continue to survive in these industries and to be able to compete, ultimately, I think that that is in the interests of a better US-China relationship. I think that the kind of really hard politics in the US-China space right now that everybody who works on US-China feels, right, is an unfortunate outcome of policy failures that we need to own, but also policy failures of the entire system. So I guess that's what I would say, is that we do need to make it happen. And I think that we need to bring along the conversation with the rest of the world, including and especially China, for others to understand why we need this to happen. I think we need to create space for others too. Robert, to your point about developing countries feeling very excited about building on the WTO system, the last WTO ministerial I went to—
It was me, not the developing countries. I felt excited.
Oh, I see. But that's different then. That's
Okay.
different, right? Because the developing countries told me one of the things that they really tried to advance in the 13th ministerial conference was just a statement that recognized more policy space for developing countries to pursue industrialization. And at the time I thought, sure, I think you need more policy space. That means more relaxation of these very restrictive rules, because that's what we need also as the United States. We need more policy space to be able to reindustrialize. I don't think that the WTO and the world was ready at that point for a meeting of the minds between the United States and the developing countries on a policy space for industrialization statement. But you know, I did see some convergence, like interesting convergence there. The ranking of Trump versus Obama versus Clinton trade policies. Ishan, you are a very clever man. This is just a trap to get me in trouble. So I'm going to take a pass on answering it.
Okay, Robert, do you want to react to any questions?
Yeah. Look, I was a member of the Clinton administration. I was in the Clinton White House. I think I give the two of them a tie. Obama continued with the tradition, in a sense, not in his first term, but in his second term. He built on what Clinton had done. And so I think I put them at the top. I think what Donald Trump is doing is severely undermining certainly the global trading system, and also pursuing a system that I don't think is in America's interest. I do believe that we should seriously think about reform in the WTO. I think the big mistake has been the one-size-fits-all policy that comes out of insisting on a single undertaking. I am much more in favor of coalitions of the willing forming. And if some group of countries wants to establish their own set of rules or a new set of rules, whether it be labor standards, whether it be foreign investment, whether it be to go deeper with integration, or to construct systems that actually allow for more flexibility or policy space, I think a pluralistic variable geometry in the WTO is what we need. And then the question arises, how do we buffer between these systems? What happens when they clash? The biggest challenge, I think, facing the whole idea of a single system is that we have fundamentally different economic systems in China and in many other Western countries. And there are inevitably going to be frictions between them. And I would like to see building on the provisions for safeguards. I think this is a much underused and it's actually been made impossible to use by advanced countries. But safeguards should be not contingent on whether or not the foreigners were unfair or fair, but simply whether they are disrupting the domestic markets of the importing countries. And in the event that imports, and actually the formulation is quite similar to that which China agreed to as a transitory safeguard when it entered the WTO, where the injury criteria was market disruption. And that, I think, could allow us to avoid finger-pointing about different systems that have been agreed. I believe these plurilaterals should be open to all who want to join them, but they should be under the aegis of the WTO dispute settlement system. And then, as I say, where the frictions arise, where there is either overcapacity or whether it's unfair subsidies, until we can reach the nirvana where we all agree on what's fair and unfair, let's just pragmatically have a system which allows for investigation, evidence of disruption, and transitory protection.
Okay, I think, we can go on for 10 more minutes, if you don't mind. So here and here.
Hi, I'm Padmashri Sampath. I'm actually senior advisor in the presidential cabinet of the African Development Bank and a senior fellow here at the Kennedy School. I have a question. Much of what both of you talked about is now playing out in the pharmaceutical sector in the US with the high level of tariffs and the effort to onshore manufacturing. And there's also, there's also been years of negotiation in the WTO and in free trade agreements, which is now being set aside for this current set of rules that the Trump administration is seeking to implement. I wanted to hear from you what you both think is the right thing to do in terms of dealing with pharmaceutical products availability and prices, whether the Trump administration set of policies is the right set of policies. And Katherine, you mentioned that you don't think that always tariffs is a good thing. It depends on which stage of the supply chain you actually put it at. So I was wondering if you can reflect on that in terms of the current administration policies on the pharmaceutical sector. The other point was about manufacturing and services. And I think that a lot of the stuff that happened during the in the 40 years of the neo-economic liberal order was also not just offshoring of manufacturing, but also loss of jobs through services sector. And I wonder what would be the components of a good U.S. industrial policy, in your opinion, that tackles both together.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting discussion to follow. My name is Maria, and I have a trade policy background. And I would like to ask you, Ambassador, a question. I was working with the WTO in between 2018 and 22. So I remember the moment when the first meeting of the appellate body took place and we kind of said goodbye to it. But also I remember the change of the administration, and everybody is like the hope that the new administration would come and change the dynamic of the WTO, in particular the appellate body. So I would like to follow up sort of on a question that Professor Lawrence raised, and what went wrong with the appellate body and why there was not that much progress. Thank you.
Maybe we can start in reverse order. Do you want to start, Robert?
Well, I'm not an expert on the pharmaceutical industry. I do believe that there has been a fundamental problem with the taxation of pharmaceutical companies, in which they can shift the profits that they make to other countries where the pharmaceuticals are being manufactured, because the intellectual property is transferred at an arbitrary price which suits them. And so I do think there needs to be reform in the taxation system which is applied to pharmaceuticals. It's always been very difficult to establish transfer prices for the purposes of calculating taxes. But in the case of pharmaceutical companies, there is flagrant abuse. And so I think we should be policing them so that they not only shift production abroad, at times leaving the United States vulnerable, but also shift profits abroad. And that's where I think there has to be a major focus. The second issue. So Edo mentioned, I have written this book on manufacturing around the world, and I actually believe that there is no advanced country that is not experiencing a declining share of manufacturing employment. And once manufacturing has peaked, it doesn't actually matter whether the countries run deficits or surpluses, they are going to experience declining shares of manufacturing. So as we look to the future of our policies, I have an aversion to the use of the word industrial, if what is meant by that is industry as conventionally defined, because the bulk of our economies today are in services. And that's where we need policies to promote productivity growth, to promote trade, e-commerce, and also even remote provision of services. And so we need to design our policies not for the economy that we used to have, but for the one we're going to have.
Thanks, Robert. Katherine?
Okay, a couple thoughts. I'd say I'm not an expert in the pharmaceutical supply chain. It's hard for me to assess, and I also have to admit I haven't followed all of the different and the latest policy developments from the Trump administration. But maybe I can give you a point of reference in terms of work that we did in the Biden administration than I did as USTR on pharmaceuticals and looking at it through the lens of trade. That would have been the TRIPS waiver exercise at the WTO. And it was a very interesting time. It was an interesting and hard exercise because there was just the moral weight of the argument that the world needed vaccines. The world's people needed access to vaccines. And it was a collective problem that we had, right? Much like climate change, as long as COVID was running unmanaged in one part of the world, we all remained very vulnerable to it. And so access to those vaccines for everyone was an important priority, a public health priority in terms of lives, but an economic priority because the lockdowns were shrinking the global economy. So what's interesting about the TRIPS waiver exercise is it was a move at the WTO to try to waive a lot of intellectual property protections for the vaccines that were going to be developed, whether they were patent protections or copyright protections, et cetera, et cetera. In order to get something through the WTO, you needed the 164 members at the time to all agree. It was also a bit of a miracle that at the 12th Ministerial Conference, we made something happen. Was it the full waiver that had been proposed by South Africa, India, and the 90 developing countries? No, right? But was it nothing? It was way more than nothing. It was a lot less than what had been proposed. And ultimately, if you look at where the TRIPS waiver came out, it was a relaxation of existing rules on compulsory licensing and a relaxation of rules prohibiting export. I highlight these things just to say that if you have the interest and the expertise to take a look at what happened, that the outcome of the TRIPS waiver exercise and negotiation was really the seed of an industrial policy, relaxation maybe of policy space for the African continent to be able to attract and negotiate contracts with pharmaceutical companies who have access to vaccine supply chains in Africa, which they didn't have during COVID. So I think that's one example of a way to approach, and I just highlight it to maybe supplement the conversation. To your point about services, I mean, you know, we might have a services-heavy economy. I think that we are light on manufacturing. I still deeply believe that there is a revitalization of manufacturing that is desirable. I have never said that revitalizing manufacturing is the only way that we have worker centrism, of course not. And in fact, in the USMCA rapid response labor enforcement mechanism, another important development is that we use that mechanism to pursue the rights of call center workers in Mexico. And in fact, I believe that is the case that the Trump administration picked up and pursued through a panel stage to secure positive findings for the workers. So services are absolutely important. It's about good family sustaining work and jobs across the economy. And I think that the focus is that we need to have a diversity of jobs that matches the diversity of talents that Americans in our economy, but people all over the world, can take up to contribute to their society's productivity. On the appellate body, this is actually an interesting area. If you talk to USTRs and WTO ambassadors going back even through the Obama, Clinton, and Bush years, maybe not Clinton because the WTO had just come into effect. I think that you might be surprised by the uniformity of perspective that there was an increasing problem in the dispute settlement system. And that over time, the appellate body did a number of things that really eroded its credibility and political legitimacy for Americans. That go to a lot of the remedy cases, but are not limited to the remedy cases. I would say one of the important cases was the big CVD case that the Chinese brought against us on our countervail, and that resulted in the public body decision. I think that that was ultimately, for those of you who are in the know, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. That ultimately was the appellate body demonstrating that not only was the WTO ineffective in disciplining China within the norms of WTO rules, it was actually going to start taking away tools that the United States and other market-based economies had, limited tools to try to counterbalance that. More broadly than that, something that I also really have to take a moment to correct the record about is I offered a full-throated endorsement of the WTO, of the need for a dispute settlement system at the WTO that would work better, that could be accessed by all WTO members, and that would actually serve the interests of all members. At the end of the day, when you look at who uses WTO dispute settlement, it's a small subset of members. Most members do not feel like they really have access to it. It's not because they don't have disputes with other members. It's because there are high barriers to entry. I offered a full-throated reform effort based on interest-based negotiations, something that was created here, the Harvard program on negotiation, the William Ury, Roger Fisher, if you bring good communication skills to negotiations, you can get out of these distributive kind of bizarre, bargaining negotiations that happen typically in bazaars over how much you're going to pay for something, right? And you can bring in new dimensions of creativity to resolve negotiations. We actually had a very robust process going all the way up until MC13. There's a New York Times article that was written about the very singularly talented Guatemalan. I think he was a deputy perm rep who was facilitating those negotiations. That process ran out of steam after he was removed from that role. And when I think that the progress was starting to scare some of the WTO members that we might actually be seeing some concrete resolution on the horizon. So the WTO should have a dispute settlement system. It should work for everybody. It should not supplant the negotiation functions. And it should address the really long-standing and deep-seated concerns that the Americans have expressed, but also concerns that other parties have expressed. And we did offer a process. And I hope that I live to see WTO members go back to the process and pick it up again. Because I'll share one story with you. At MC13, we were standing in line for lunch, and one of my lawyers in Geneva, we were waiting for, I think we had trays to pick up lunch from a kind of a cafeteria. And one of the interpreters from Geneva, right, now in Abu Dhabi for the ministerial conference, leaned over and asked my legal advisor in Geneva, do you think that the dispute settlement negotiations will continue? And he said, well, I certainly hope so. And she said, well, I have to tell you, we hope so too. It is the one negotiation that the interpreters look forward to interpreting for in Geneva, because it is the one place where delegates don't just sit there reading the same talking points to each other month after month after month. We actually see people talking to each other, listening to each other, and we are tracking the evolution of the conversation. Frankly, I wish that more people would know about the process that we started, because I think that there are seeds for a complete overhaul for the WTO that are in that particular exercise.
So thanks a lot. Maybe something we didn't discuss enough is also the role of technological progress and how it is related to the losses in manufacturing jobs. Because according to the IMF, 2/3 of the manufacturing jobs that were lost in the US over the last 20 years were lost because of automatization and not because of trade. So I think that can be the focus of another panel in the future. I want to thank you.
I thought you were going to give me 20 seconds to respond.
If you wish, you can.
No,
okay. No, but we can organize another panel in the future. So I want to thank you, Katherine and Robert, for the candid conversation, and I wish you all a nice rest of the evening. Bye.